Well, again, thank you all for being here. I'm Harold Mock, Director of Georgia College's Leadership Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Usery Forum on Leadership. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of hosting General Philip Breedlove. Before we begin our forum, I must say this event is being recorded. By participating in this program, you are consenting to being recorded. If you would prefer to view the recording instead of participating, please leave this meeting and email leadership.programs@gcsu.edu. We're honored to welcome General Breedlove to Milledgeville and to Georgia College. Vivian Casanidi, our Newman Civic Fellow, will introduce General Breedlove momentarily, but allow me briefly to say a few words about this event. The Usery Forum is Georgia College's presentation discussion series on leadership for the public good. The forum honors the memory of the 15th U.S. Secretary of Labor, W.J. Usery, Jr. This series is made possible through the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Melvin and Elise Usery. Secretary Usery began his career as a machinist at the naval shipyards in Brunswick, and during the Second World War enlisted in the United States Navy and became an underwater welder on a repair ship in the Pacific. He built a long and storied career in service to his country and ultimately negotiated some of the most difficult labor disputes of the 20th century. Secretary Usery had a unique ability to bring people together in the name of ideas and causes bigger than themselves. And that's precisely what we honor and celebrate here this evening, embodied in our distinguished presenter. General Breedlove was, until his retirement in 2016, Supreme Allied Commander Europe and a general in the United States Air Force. As Supreme Allied Commander, General Breedlove commanded NATO's Allied Command Operations, responsible for planning and execution of all NATO military operations, including maintaining the integrity of Allied territory, safeguarding freedom of the seas, and preservation of members' security. In short, he had the most difficult job in the world, protecting freedom and democracy from those who would wish to destroy them. General Breedlove served, of course, as Supreme Allied Commander. His predecessor, and the first person to hold that job, General Dwight Eisenhower, in his 1958 State of the Union address, famously described what that entailed. "Our real problem," he said, "is not our strength today. It is rather the vital necessity of action today to ensure our strength tomorrow." More than any other leader since that earliest generation, Eisenhower and Truman and Acheson, General Breedlove has done precisely that: lead in the present with a relentless focus on the future. Under his leadership, he worked with allies to reshape and revitalize NATO. And he did so working with partners, both civilian and military, from 28 member states across languages and cultures, bringing people together. We are fortunate indeed to have him at Georgia College and to have him share his message of leadership and service with us this afternoon. I would like to acknowledge a few of our special guests who are with us today, members of our Leadership Advisory Board, Colonel Tom Torrance, Mr. and Mrs. Tom and Sandra Rossiter, and Mr. Jimmy Childry. Also like to acknowledge mentors in our Georgia Education Mentorship Program, including Gary Marks, CEO of Piedmont National Corporation, and Mr. Childry, CEO of Childry Ford. We're fortunate to have with us 12 Falcon Scholars from Georgia Military College who are preparing for an appointment to the U.S. Air Force Academy. They are led here by Colonel Dwayne Clayton. And Falcon Scholars, if you would, please stand and be recognized. Colonel Clayton, please. Thank you all for being with us. I'd like to acknowledge the many university leaders who are with us, including our president, President Kathy Cox, our provost, Dr. Costas Spiro, who are with us, as well as I see many of our deans and department chairs and wonderful colleagues. We're joined by many guests online, including our alumni from across Georgia and the country. And whether you're a Bobcat, a Colonial, or a Jessie, we want to welcome you this afternoon and hope that our conversation with General Breedlove will remind you why we all love Georgia College so much. We have the opportunity to ask and answer important questions and to share in commitment to something greater than ourselves. We hope to have you again with us on campus soon. Most of all, students, I'm glad that you all are here. It's a great joy to me as a teacher to know that you will learn about leadership from so distinguished a practitioner. So students, thank you all for being here. And I'll say, I know that there are many other places that you could be. So it's a great joy to me to know that you all want to learn about leadership from General Breedlove. We encourage you, whether you're with us here in Milledgeville or dialing in, please join the conversation using social media and using the hashtag #ForThePublicGood. Please also connect with us on social media at Lead Creatively. Everyone, and especially students, one of the most important elements of these events is that we hear from you. We will have the opportunity to have a discussion with General Breedlove, but I encourage you to shape our discussion and our conversation by making notes on the note cards you have in front of you and considering ideas that General Breedlove introduces that you might like to follow up on. Also consider, what would you like to hear from us in future Usery forums? Since I have you all, students, as a captive audience, I want to remind you that Georgia College provides you a subscription to the New York Times. I imagine that there are very few ideas that our guest will introduce this afternoon that would not be enriched by regularly reading the newspaper and engaging with informed debate from those with whom you agree and with whom you disagree. Georgia College students, faculty, and staff all have a free subscription to the New York Times in partnership with the American Democracy Project and sponsored by the Office of the Provost. It is only waiting for you to activate it. You can scan this QR code here, or they are on your tables as well. I did it in my class. It'll take you less than 60 seconds to access your New York Times subscription. If you're less comfortable with QR codes, just type in accessnyt.com. In addition to your subscription to the New York Times, I'll remind you that Russell Library maintains subscriptions to dozens of newspapers and magazines. And students, as I tell many of you often, now is the time of your life to develop a healthy news diet. If you don't want to go to the library, I've got all of these sitting on my desk in my office, and you can come read those copies too. With that, thank you again for being here and for joining us. I would like to call on Vivian Casaniti, Georgia College's Newman Civic Fellow, to introduce General Breedlove. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. General Philip Breedlove is a proven strategic planner, motivational leader, and talented communicator. He's a highly decorated, retired general of the U.S. Air Force, where he reached the highest levels of military leadership as one of the 6 geographic combatant commanders and Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. During 39 years of service, General Breedlove served in a variety of demanding command and staff positions, leading large-scale, diverse global operations across 2 theaters of combat and earning a reputation as an inspirational leader focused on his people, their families, and mission accomplishment. Leading a diverse political military alliance, he was able to build consensus and form teams to accomplish complex tasks spanning multiple continents. As Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander of U.S. European Command, he answered directly to NATO's governing body, the North Atlantic Council, and to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. He led the most comprehensive and strategic structural and policy security changes in the alliance's 70-year history. His diplomatic skills reassured allies, deterred potential aggressors, and maintained alliance unity during the most dynamic and challenging period since its inception. He led the forces of 28 nations and multiple partners in ensuring the security of an alliance that accounts for more than half of the world's domestic gross product. Before his service as Supreme Allied Commander, General Breedlove served as Vice Chief Staff of the U.S. Air Force and Assistant Chief of Staff for Air Operations Plans and Requirements. General Breedlove holds a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology, a Master of Science degree in Aerospace Technology from Arizona State University, and a Master of International Security Affairs from the National War College. Please join me in welcoming General Philip Breedlove to Georgia College.
I often look around when those kind of introductions are made to figure out who they're talking about. So today, we're not really going to talk just about leadership, although leadership will be a part of the conversation. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about Ukraine. As you heard in the introduction, I was the commander of NATO when Russia invaded Ukraine the first 2 times back in 2014, and then led the changes that we made in NATO to be able to address a Russian threat. And now, following that, and looking at what's happening in Ukraine now, I continue to do some work for both the State Department and the Department of Defense as our alliance, as the Western nations are addressing yet again aggression by Russia in Europe. So I'm going to talk first today a little bit about Ukraine. And then I'm going to shamelessly then use the time to talk a little bit about an endeavor, a group of work that Georgia Tech is a part of, as well as several other large schools, called Peace Engineering. And I'll use the problem of Ukraine to say that in the future we need to address problems like this maybe in a different way and talk to you about the work that is being done in this area of peace engineering. A couple of ground rules. I'm going to give you at least half of the period, if not more, to ask questions. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. But if I say something that just makes you want to leap up out of your seat, and let's get to your question right then. You're not going to bother me. I've covered this kind of stuff so many times. If I can't get through it and get interrupted, then I'm in trouble. So there'll be at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. So start thinking about them now, or I'm going to start pointing at you and asking you questions. But if you have something that is burning you up when I speak, just jump up here and let's get after it so that we can address what's concerning you. Technology's working. So I bring you greetings from Angel Cabrera, the president of Georgia Tech, and Adam Stuhlberg, the chair of the school that I teach in now, which is the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. And I couldn't be more happy to be here with you all today. I've already had a few of you in class this morning, and it was an absolutely superior exchange. The questions I was asked were all thinking questions, great questions about U.S. policy. On the bottom right-hand side of this slide you're looking at is the crest of the commander of NATO. And the words in there essentially say, they're in Latin, they essentially say that vigilance is the price of freedom. And what we find as we sort of stumbled into Ukraine is that we had lost some of the vigilance that we once had about Russia and Europe. And so I think that will be a central part of the conversation here for the next few slides. I'm not going to lecture to every line on every slide. These are really just to facilitate conversation and maybe, just maybe, to get your juices riled up with a good question for when we come to the Q&A portion. So this is a picture of Europe, and all focus right now is on Ukraine. But as I challenged the class this morning, If you go back and look, about 8 days, it may have been 9 or 10, but about 8 days before the war started, Mr. Putin sent two essentially letters or draft documents to the West. His target was really the United States, but it was addressed to the West. If you haven't read those documents and you are you study U.S. policy, I commend them to you on Google. They would take you maybe 8 or 9 minutes to read both of them. They're not terribly long. But in these documents that some have called draft treaties, others have called memoranda, and some just called demands, Mr. Putin essentially lays out his vision for Europe. And in a few simple words, I would describe that vision as Mr. Putin demanded that the West return to a structure, a security structure in Europe that is very similar to the Cold War and the Soviet Union days, demanding weapons moving, forces moving, and all Americans out of certain portions of Europe, so that he could reassert control over those portions of Europe and rebuild the buffer nations between Russia and the West. So why do I bring all this up? Right now, we are certainly concerned about Ukraine. Men and women are dying. Kids are dying. Kids are being kidnapped. Ukraine is a huge mess, and we're very much worried about it. But it's bigger than Ukraine. Ukraine is one step, the first step for Mr. Putin. And in his two documents, which you can go online and Google, you could read the bigger plan. And that bigger plan is for many more nations in Europe. And so as we worry about what we're going to do about Ukraine and whether we will be involved more in the future or less, we have to remember it's bigger than Ukraine. And this is just the first step. And Mr. Putin tells that to us. We don't have to guess it. He wrote it down, handed us the documents, and said, sign them, or there will be other means. Now, that's a translation of Russian words. But essentially, what we understand now is he's saying, sign these two documents, or there will be war in Ukraine. We did not sign the documents, and there was war in Ukraine. This is a recapturing sort of the main points of those documents. And I'm just going to sum them up. I'm not going to read you that slide. But essentially it said, less NATO force, no NATO weapons, and no U.S. forces in those border states. In other words, he's trying to recast the security architecture of Europe. And his thinking was based on this sort of historical record of what has happened. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, not this Georgia, but the Georgia, and seized about 20% of the nation of Georgia. And the West allowed that to happen, and still is allowing it to happen today. Russian forces still occupy 1/5 of the nation of Georgia. Our response in the West, in my words, we rewarded bad behavior by allowing them to keep portions of Georgia. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. For the first 2 times, they invaded Crimea. Pretty bloodless, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, why that happened, but pretty bloodless. And then he invaded the Donbass, portions of the Donbass, which is sort of like the county name for the southeast part of Ukraine in the vicinity of Lugansk and Donetsk. And when 2014 was over, essentially we rewarded his bad behavior by allowing him to hold about 12% of Ukraine. Now Russia is back in Ukraine, has invaded it and had some bad results, but they still now are in possession of about 22% of Ukraine. And the question is now in 2022 and 23, are we once again going to reward bad behavior and allow Russia to hold onto that land? Or will we, in a policy sense, support Ukraine to get to a different outcome? So this is a whole list of what I would call new strategic objectives. And these objectives are from both sides of the approach. So Russia, first and foremost, because we've seen Putin is in trouble. He's in trouble in his own country. And in fact, most of his messaging now is actually to try to preserve his control of Russia. So the first object of his messaging is his own people. The rest is for the rest of the world. He wants to replace a Putin-friendly government in Ukraine. His first objectives in the war was just to take Ukraine, depose Zelensky, and install a Russian puppet. He took a whipping in the north, and then he took a whipping in the southeast. So he sort of reset his objectives now, and really it's just to get a Putin-friendly regime in place. He wants to hold on to all of the territory he currently holds. And that's this red picture here. This is Ukraine, obviously. This is the east. And he had all of this up here at one point, but the Ukrainian army has defeated him and pushed him out. And now he's in this portion, and he wants to hold on to that. At all costs, he wants to hold on to Crimea. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, about why Crimea is so important to Russia. And because he has learned that he cannot beat the Ukrainian army in the field, he has taken the war now to the citizens of Ukraine. And I know you've seen this in the news for many months now. He's been rebelizing their cities, knocking down their hospitals, knocking down their schools. And we'll cover some of the other horrific things in a few minutes that they have been doing. But essentially, they have determined that the only way to win in Ukraine now is to not fight the Ukrainian army head-to-head, rather to take the fight to the civilian population of Ukraine. We in the West fall into two camps. And geography largely defines those two camps. If you're in a nation like the Baltic nations, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, very close to Russia, your opinion is that we have to support Ukraine until Russia is completely out of Ukraine at all costs, because they know they're next. If Ukraine falls, then one of them is next. If you are in the old part of NATO and the United States, we fall into this camp. That is to do what we can for Ukraine, but do not provoke Russia, because I'll use a bad word, but we are afraid of Mr. Putin stepping up the fight. He keeps threatening World War III or using nuclear weapons. About once a week, he threatens to use nuclear weapons. And so the two camps in NATO are still very much close to each other about what they're trying to do, but the end game is different. We, and I want to put this right on the United States, are sort of the derivative policy that we come out of Washington. And as soon as I had this slide built, of course, we have some announcements today that are changing that dynamic a little bit. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we are there to support Ukraine up to, but not beyond, defending itself. In other words, we in the United States have a policy right now whereby we are giving Ukraine defensive weapons. And until today, when we may have had a policy shift that we are going to provide tanks, we have not provided offensive weapons like aircraft, tanks and the longer range artillery you may have heard about, the ATACMS. So we have been giving Ukraine defensive capabilities, not offensive capabilities. Okay. Realizing that they can't fight and win in a head-to-head contest with the Ukrainian army, Russia has increased its what we call gray zone fight. Have any of you ever heard the word hybrid war? That's a word that's used quite a lot. Some call it a gray zone war. These are military-style actions across the full gamut of national power. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And as a part of that, Ukraine has been subjugated to a war that we haven't seen for 70 or more years. A war that is really fought as much in the minds of the enemy as it is on the ground. As you see here, Mr. Putin is constantly threatening the West with nukes because we are afraid of that, and he knows that, and he's trying to amplify our fear every week about nukes. We don't want to see Americans fighting on the battlefield, and Mr. Putin amplifies that problem several times a month, saying if we lose, this will go to World War III, and we will be fighting Americans on the battlefield, because he wants to increase the fear in America about that. He was taken to task by his own leadership about his bellicose talk about nuclear weapons. And so what did he do? Well, then he started talking about dirty bombs. You may remember this very, very recently. In fact, he started an entire disinformation campaign that said that Ukraine was building a dirty bomb in order to blame it on Russia. But what we saw was Russia, again, trying to amp up the fear about this. And most of you know that final line, Zaporizhzhia, is where the nuclear plant is there. And Russia was firing on the nuclear plant with their artillery, which could have led to an ugly thing. As you all know, one of the worst nuclear disasters in the world was on Ukrainian soil. And what we know there is that the Russians were firing, and now they've ceased, thank goodness. I told you that Russia has taken the war to the Ukrainian people. This man on the right is Valery Gerasimov. He and I were peers at one point, because he was the commander of Russian forces and I was the commander of all of NATO forces, and we used to talk once a month. The first couple of times we talked, it was about our families and children and etc. But by about the third time we started talking about substantive problems between us. You may have heard that recently, because the war is going so badly for Russia and Ukraine, that they fired the guy that was running the war, and they've asked Valery back to lead the war in Ukraine. This is a statement about what he said. This is his, again, Russian words translated into English. He basically said the very rules of war has changed. In other words, don't bother me with your stories about us killing civilians, blowing up hospitals, blowing up schools, blowing up the electricity supply, etc., etc. It's all a part of this new piece of war. And this is not new. Oh, by the way, most of you have not probably studied Russian actions when they fought the Chechens. And what they did to Grozny, the largest Chechen city, is exactly what you see going on in Ukraine right now. Basically, no concern for rubblizing a city. No matter who's in the buildings or what the buildings are for, just knock it all down and sort out whoever's left when we get ready to leave. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. And if you remember recently, when we first took over land that Russia had held, it was in a town called Busha. And Busha is on the northwest side of Kyiv, and this was the first place that Russian forces were defeated. And when we took over Busha, we found horrible, horrible instances of mass murder. Many people shot in the back of the head. That's not a tactical shooting. We saw many instances and recorded many instances of rape and many instances of taking young Russian children away and moving them, or young Ukrainian children away and returning them to Russia. Russia has a big demographic problem in their mind. The Slavic race is in decline, and part of the solution now is to take Ukrainian children and send them back to various places around Russia to try to repopulate the Slavic race. So this is a simple slide for a simple man. I'm a fighter pilot, and as some of you who have been in the military know, fighter pilots are, most people see them as knuckle-dragging men and women that repetition is a good thing and keep everything simple and always have a picture. That's what they say about talking to fighter pilots. So when I was asked to build a model at Georgia Tech for military power, we used this one, DIME, because I can remember it. There are far better, far more academically correct models, but this one even a fighter pilot can remember. DIME stands for diplomatic power, informational and intelligence power, military power, and economic power. And what I would like to point out to you is how Russia uses DIME and how the United States uses DIME. Oops, got over-aggressive there. When Russia attacks, they use every tool that they have. Diplomatically in Ukraine, they were trying to discredit the Zelensky government and say that it was illegitimate and say that it was installed by the U.S. CIA. They had all manner of informational attacks. Disinformation is a better way of saying it. And most of those were at trying to discredit the Zelensky government. They were the ones that made most of the jokes that you were reading in your social media about the comedian is now leading Ukraine. Most of those posts came straight out of the troll farm in St. Petersburg. And so disinformation was a big thing. Militarily, we see what they're doing. Russia, a world superpower, has massed its army, crossed an internationally recognized border, seized land, and punished the people of a bordering nation. So they have used the M. And then in E, the economic tool set, their biggest tool is energy. Raising prices, recalling loans, cutting nations off from energy. So what we see is that Russia uses every tool out there to fight us. Time for audience participation. When we have a dispute with Russia, which tools do we use? Anybody want to hazard a guess? What do you hear about almost every day on TV when we talk about, quote unquote, punishing Russia? Sanctions. When we just have disputes with Russia, we use sanctions. More sanctions, special sanctions, extra special sanctions, really tough extra special sanctions. That's what we do to Russia. Now, we are obviously beginning to help supply military aid, but we're not employing it, we're supplying it to Ukraine. So the reason I bring this up is that it's important to note that when we fight against folks like Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia, they are very comfortable with using every tool of national power to attack us. When we fight Russia, we're only comfortable with really doing economic things. A test question. What do we fight radical Islam, Daesh, ISIS, ISIL? What tool do we use when we fight them? Say it really loud for me. I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely. Perfect. When we fight radical Islam, we fight them with what I call trittanol and steel, which means bombs. So we're not very good in the United States at using a balanced reattack. We tend to focus in silos. Economically with countries like China and Russia, and we use military might against more terrorist or smaller organized opponents. And so we need, I think, to develop a more balanced reply. I'm not going to read this bottom part. I already talked to you about it a little bit. These are the new tools, the acknowledged tools today of Russia and Ukraine. One of the most striking things I ever read was the letter from the Russian wife who told her soldier, it's okay for you to rape Ukrainian women. This is appropriate. And so this thing that Mr. Gerasimov said about new warfare is a very tough thing. So what? I'm going to let you read this. I was criticized for this top thing. I said it in testimony in the HASC. And that is, I've got a lot of experience raising children and grandchildren. And here's what I know. If you reward bad behavior or if you allow bad behavior to stand, you're going to get more bad behavior. Okay? So we need to make policy decisions about how we're going to address this kind of thing into the future. I'll just let you read the rest of it. So now I want to shamelessly talk to you a little bit about a framework of approaching problems that might keep us out of this kind of thing in the future called peace engineering. I got to go out here and use my pointer. You know people from Georgia Tech, they've got to have a chart with a graph on it. So if we look at international problems on a grand scale where the degree of intensity goes all the way to war, or if we look at problems like gun violence in Philadelphia, you've got a problem that grows, and over time, we try to avoid that problem. In the concept of peace engineering, we work to avoid the problem. If we can't avoid it, we work to dampen the problem and hopefully get down the slope as soon as we can. If the slope goes all the way to big violence, then we work to restore to the previous peaceful position in peace engineering. So what's big news about that? That doesn't really scratch your interest, does it? I mean, it sounds like everybody would do that. The real piece of peace engineering comes from marrying the thoughts of two very disparate sets of people and trying to use them collaboratively together at the same time to develop solutions that are durable. Those two types of people are engineering thinking people, engineers, and social scientists, social sciences kinds of people. What happens in most issues of growing concern of violence in the world is social scientists work on solutions, and engineers work on solutions, and they never really talk to each other. I like to tell the story of water problems in North Africa. The engineer said, we need wells. Went in there, built some wells. And that caused a lot more violence because they built the wells in an area that the warlords can control, and then the warlords used those wells as a weapon against the people. If we had talked to and listened to social scientists and social sciences people in the beginning, they might have told us, don't build your well there. I don't care if that's the closest water table or whatever. Don't build it there. It's going to cause more problems. We might have built those wells in a different place. It's a very simplified example of how when we work problems apart from each other, like these two groups, engineers and social scientists do every day in this world, we're going to come to non-durable solutions. I love this slide because it's a picture, and fighter pilots love pictures. But here is an iceberg. Above the water on this iceberg are the visible signs of a problem that engineers absolutely love. They need water. Dig a well. Boom, we're done. But what is below the waterline is purposely much larger because of all of those societal problems that engineers are absolutely not good at. They need help. And so peace engineering is old tools used in a new way, whereby we bring engineers and social scientists together at the beginning of a problem, and we force them to work together through the solution so that we don't have the well dug in the wrong spot in Sudan or in Algeria or in wherever. Rather, we have social scientists helping to build the solutions that the engineers in place physically, because they have a better understanding of how the social science changes the outcome. And so peace engineering is just an attempt to get at these things, which we're not good at in most places, the below the line pieces which cause so much of the violence in the world. We need to recognize it and incorporate it in our solution sets. And so peace engineering is actually now taking off as an academic endeavor. And there are 4 or 5 really good and big schools that have peace engineering programs. Georgia Tech is developing their peace engineering program. I'm not here to shill for that program, but what I'm saying is that academically, this now has deep roots and is growing, and I think it is a great endeavor into the future. And what I also hope will happen is we are now doing small actual applications of peace engineering teams. Gun violence in Philadelphia is one, and then the social services of water, electricity, sanitary in Syria is another one, where we have a cross-functional peace engineering style team to address large societal problems. And I think that there is a way ahead there. Okay, I'm 4 minutes late. Who's got the first question? And we can talk about anything you want to talk about. I didn't really talk a lot about leadership. I'm happy to share, if you want, in the Q&A, my thoughts on leadership.
So if you would, raise your hand. Kate and Abigail have microphones. For our guests who are online, it's important that you actually say your question into the microphone, please. So do wait until a microphone comes to you to ask your question of General Breedlove. I did see some hands up right here. Yep. So Kate, if you would.
Hi there. So you were talking about a little bit of Russian aggression and Putin's issue, possibly threatening World War III and all that. Do you think the threat of Russia invading Poland and causing World War III by invading NATO countries, is that a real threat we face here in the United States with consequences here? Or is that just Putin's rhetoric to try to put the United States into submission, for lack of a better term?
So it's a great question. I must tell you, I get asked this in almost every forum I go to. So I do believe that Mr. Putin understands what a NATO nation is. And I do believe that he understands the criticality of making that step across a NATO nation's lines. But two things. One, as strategic and military planners, meeting the National Security Council and DoD, we have to plan for every contingency, or we would be blamed for not having planned for it. And so we have to consider those as a possibility. Let me paint you a picture that would be really ugly. Is anybody in here familiar with the nation of Estonia? Do we have any Estonians in here? So Estonia is the northernmost Baltic nation. In the northern part of Estonia, the extreme northeast part, it's a little point that goes up along the Baltic Sea towards Russia, is a town called Narva. Narva is almost 100% ethnically Russian. And not one of them want to be a Russian. They all want to be Estonians, and they say it all the time. But Russia looks to Narva and says that's a Russian-speaking enclave that is being held captive by NATO. And so the fear is not that Russia would race across a NATO border. The fear is that Russia might take, for instance, Narva, and then say, we have to, just like they said in Ukraine, we have to go in and save our Slavic brothers and sisters from NATO. And if they ran into Narva and took Narva, what happens to the NATO alliance? Will they answer? Will they not answer? Will they be divided on policy? And I think Mr. Putin would very much love to see that play out, to find out and try to bust up the alliance. So I sort of tangentially answered your question. To recap, I don't believe he's foolish. He understands what NATO is. But he's also an opportunist. And if he could snatch a portion of NATO land and say, see, I invaded and Article 5 is meaningless. He gets everything he wants if NATO breaks up.
And General, just to clarify, can you remind some of our audience may not know what Article 5 is of the North Atlantic Treaty?
So if you're familiar with NATO, there are several articles. The most important is Article 5. I like to talk even more about Article 3, but Article 5 of the NATO treaty essentially says attack against one is an attack against all. And all of those in NATO by Article 5 are held responsible for coming to the defense of any one nation that is attacked. Oh, by the way, anyone know when Article 5 was invoked in NATO? Only one time has Article 5 been invoked, and that's when the United States came under attack by the terrorists. Our brothers and sisters in Europe invoked Article 5 and were a part of coming to our defense against those terrorists. And all of NATO, of course, participated in the military option in Afghanistan, which I commanded for a couple of years. We have one right over here, too.
Yes, sir. While we're waiting on the microphone, General, earlier today you talked about the value of planning. And either you did or I did, quoted Dwight Eisenhower that plans are nothing but planning is everything. And I wonder if you can talk about that in the context of Ukraine, how we prepare for what we don't know.
And I also reminded you of the great philosopher Mike Tyson, who said, plan is a good thing to have right up till you get smashed in the face. So, yes, what we're trying to do with Ukraine now is really understand what is the long-term plan. What is the policy of the West? And I don't do politics, but I am sometimes critical of things that politicians say, and I've been labeled by a former Speaker of the House as being an equal opportunity basher because I bash left and I bash right. But the fact of the matter, we are currently in a place where our policy makes planning tough because we have to decide first what our objective in Ukraine is. And you remember on the slide, there are two camps. One camp says return all Ukrainian land to Ukraine, and the other camp is give Ukraine enough that we don't incite war with Russia, but no more. And so how do you plan in that environment? And what we're trying to do now to determine what types of weapons are appropriate to give to Ukraine are all a part of determining an objective, setting a plan, and in that plan, having to make certain assumptions which can turn out to be a real problem for planners. I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
Yes, sir. You had a question right here, please.
Okay, so earlier on you said that Russia had attacked or invaded Georgia, but the United States kind of didn't do anything. Do you know why?
Well, the United States did do some things, and in fact did a lot and invoked some other nations to do some things. But in the end, the United States and the West allowed Russia to stay in Georgia. If you're familiar with the nation of Georgia, there is a huge oblast, which is like a state, called South Ossetia, and there's another oblast called Abkhazia, and Russia is still occupying South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and that's about 20% of the nation. So several nations helped Georgia, again, to a certain limited amount, but because Russia was, again, threatening World War III and nuclear retaliation and all of that, we stopped the support, and we are now in what is called a frozen conflict in Georgia, where Russia still occupies 20% of those forces, of that nation. Does that answer?
Yep, thank you.
Along with earlier invasions, Russian invasions, you mentioned Crimea a few times. Oh, there we go. You mentioned Crimea a few times. Can you describe the reasons behind a Russian invasion of Crimea and the greater implications?
Okay. It starts right with the sentence she said. When a Russian talks about Crimea, a Russian says the Crimea, sort of like we would say the South, the East, the West, because Russians, at least especially in Mr. Putin's mind, see, in their words, I never say those, but I will now, the Crimea, they see it as a part of Greater Russia. Two, there are both military and economic reasons. Militarily, Sevastopol, which is the large port on Crimea, is Russia's only deep water, warm water port in the world. It is the only place, the Admiral could walk you through this, it's the only place where they have 365-day access to the oceans of the world. All of their ports in the north freeze up in the winter. And so Sevastopol on Crimea, militarily, is incredibly important to Russia. And then finally, and I think this is what you're getting to, finally, the second biggest world national gas field is right off the coast of Crimea. And Russia is about petrochemical economy. That is their number one export. And they, by holding Crimea, they say that those fields are theirs. The world refuses to accept Russia's invasion and occupation of Crimea, but Russia doesn't. They are very much preparing to remove that energy and that economic boost from those waters around Crimea.
Hi, I'm over here. I kind of wanted to ask a question about leadership, kind of pulling back from this. We're growing up in this time where we have to be aware of facilitating these conversations around supporting, our ideas and things like that. How do we facilitate and continue to facilitate conversations as the future leaders in America about supporting our NATO allies? How do we continue to build kind of leadership skills within this peace engineering mindset?
So, what an awesome question.
Sounds like a planted question.
I could talk
doesn't it?
for 40 minutes here, but I'll try to do it in 4 or 5. The first thing, and I'm very encouraged, by the way, because of the class I had this morning, the questions they were asking me were thinking questions, meaning they are taking step one. Step one is you have to be educated. You can't just walk in and express your opinion and not substantiate your thoughts. Former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, once chastised me and he said, "Breedlove, that's an unsupported assertion." And I sort of asked him, "Sir, I've served 8 times in Europe. Do you think I could talk a little bit about Europe?" He said, "Okay, I can live with that." But the bottom line is, you have to educate. And I would offer to you that you need to be aware of both sides of an issue to be able to really deal with that issue in public spaces and lead. If you come to a meeting and all you have is your side of the equation and things to support your side of the equation, it's going to be a tough meeting at the national strategic level, because very educated people are going to take you on from the other side of the question. So for you all, and again, I was encouraged by what I saw this morning, step one in order to lead in these international spaces is to be well informed. And I got to stand for this, I'm sorry, but well informed doesn't mean you have that side or that side. Well informed means you understand the left and right of a problem. It's your obligation to come to the table educated and understanding all the issues. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, many of you are already doing this. You need to vote. I don't care who you vote for. I don't care if you vote left or you vote right. You need to vote. You need to get out and vote. You need to get your brothers and sisters, friends, neighbors, everybody to go vote, because America needs to understand what Americans are thinking about. I said today, I deal in this pretty small circle in Washington, D.C. on a few issues. When I go out and have a session like this one or like I had this morning, I start to remember what other people are thinking about, and it's really important. But you need to vote and make sure that your representatives know where you stand on these things. And then the last thing I would say is, do not be afraid. So again, I'm not making remark about left or right. But there are a lot of people in this world who don't want to hear your opinion unless your opinion agrees with theirs. And that's so bad for a democracy. You need to educate yourself, form a well-informed opinion, and then you need to be vocal about it. And make your thoughts heard and known. And that's the first 3 steps I would give you for leadership in a time like this.
I see we have Walker, you have a question. Thank you, Kate.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming out here and speaking to us at Georgia College. I'm sure everybody here is very appreciative of that. And my question is about this semicircle of flags of NATO. And in the middle, you said it was Latin for vigilance is the price of freedom. You said in the recent years or recent times, U.S. has kind of lost a little bit of that vigilance towards Russia.
I think I said the West has lost that vigilance.
Okay, the
But
West.
we're a part of the West, so
Okay.
you're intentionally correct.
The West has lost a little bit of that vigilance towards Russia and within Europe. Could you touch a little bit on that and
Yeah.
explain that a little more?
So those of us who are quite a bit older than you, we lived through the time where the wall fell. In fact, the day the wall fell, I have the funniest story of my experience. But we have all lived through the fall of the Iron Curtain. We call it the fall of the wall. And what we saw, what we thought we saw, was a Russia that was throwing off the old shackles of the Soviet Union. And we thought and we wanted and we believed that they were going to embrace democracy and move towards the West in sharing the values that we hold. We is, always perturbations, but sharing the big values that the West embraced. And there were a small group of Russian leaders who really were trying to do that. But what we know now, and learned authors like Angela Stent and others write about it all the time, what we know now is that there was this layer of bureaucrats, military leaders, KGB leaders below that some have called the apparatchik. And those people were never, their minds were never changed. All this was a temporary setback, and they were working already to try to reestablish the Soviet Union. That's the group that Mr. Putin came out of. And so what we saw was, and I used this in an ugly way, but I used it to a purpose. When I talk about this in the Congress and other places, I talk about for almost 20 years, we were trying to hug the bear. The bear did not want to be hugged. And what we see now, starting in 2008, is that the bear came out of his cave. Hibernation was over. They attacked. Now it's bigger than this. Georgia had some issues too. But the fact of the matter is, Russia, a monstrous country, used a huge military to attack a little tiny country, and still holds 20% of that country today. And what we in the West quickly convinced ourselves that this is an aberration. Russia really does want to rejoin the West. Let's get back to business with Russia. And every year, Europe is becoming more and more dependent on Russian gas and oil. And we were trying to get back to normal. And then in 2014, we were, quote unquote, surprised when Russia invaded Ukraine again. And even in 2022, we were a little bit surprised when Russia attacked again. The fact is, we caused our own problem because we were seeing what we wanted to see rather than what was actually happening in Russia. And all along, the people that grew out of the disgrace of the fall of the wall are now the oligarchs and the kleptocrats that are running Russia, and Putin being one of those. I know somebody from this morning's class answered my question. What did Mr. Putin say about the fall of the wall? Sing it out loud if you know it. Mr. Putin said it was the greatest catastrophe of our lifetime that the Soviet Union was dissolved. They never intended to become a part of the West. And we lost vision of that. And that is costing us now because many nations were absolutely unprepared for what they're trying to get prepared for now.
I'm afraid we're nearly to the end of our time. I have one question for you, General Breedlove. You led a 39-year career in the Air Force. You've been a fighter pilot. You have commanded led many men and women. You have built relationships across borders. You were in the Pentagon on September 11th. You have, I suppose, led a long career of service to others. What is it that motivates you in your leadership? When you think about some of the difficulties you face, some of the difficult decisions that you've had to make, what is it that you fall back on?
Well, so I had 8 major commands, and so I got the chance to work with some incredible teams and incredible people. What motivated me the most is exactly that. It's the people and the team that you have been given to lead through a mission. And there is nothing more fulfilling to me than being a part of a team that succeeds. And so there's a few things I like to remember about leadership. The first one is great leaders understand completely that it is about the team. It is not about them. Leadership is not about you. When a leader is talking to those that they lead, listen to the words they use. When a leader, now not just giving a normal speech or something, but when a leader is talking to his or her team about a mission, listens to the words that they use. If that leader, every other word is I, me, my, or mine, you got a problem. If every other word is we, us, they, and team, now you got a leader that understands how a mission is going to be done. When you're a young leader, as a young fighter pilot leading 12 or 16 other airplanes to go destroy a target, it's a smaller problem to think about. But the more senior you get in leadership, the farther you personally are removed from the actual action. I flew my last combat sortie as a brigadier general, but that was only because I commanded the base that we were fighting the war from, and I demanded to get to go fly. But normally, the more senior you get, the less you actually have contact with those who are truly leading the team or doing the mission. It's the airmen that do the mission. It's the soldiers that do the mission. It's the seamen in the Navy and the Marines on the battlefield that really do the mission. The leaders, their job is to organize, train, equip, and enable those that actually are doing the mission. So I think probably the most important leadership action or axiom I could leave you with is it's not about you when you're a leader. It's about the team and the mission that the team has to do. And if you keep your focus on the soldiers, you keep your focus on the airmen and Navy, Marines, etc., you will then get the job done because they will do it for you. So I'm not sure I hit the ball out of the park, but the bottom line is it's all about the troops. And if you self-aggrandize and everything's about I, me, my, and mine, you're going to fail at some point. You won't keep moving forward. You will fail.
I think the clicker is right here. I hope you'll join me, please, in thanking General Breedlove for being with us at Georgia College. I want to point your attention, if you would like, I encourage you to scan that QR code or go to this URL and take a look at our ideas bulletin. We also have copies for you in the back. This is our latest publication, and it showcases some of the wonderful ideas that our students and our guests generate. We have a few upcoming events I'd like you to consider, and perhaps you want to hold to these dates. The next in our Usery Forum series will be on Monday, February 20th. We will host T. Dallas Smith, founder and CEO of T. Dallas Smith and Company. On March 24th, we are hosting TEDx Georgia College. Ticket sales open this week, and you can get those at tedxgeorgiacollege.com. And likewise, please hold the date, Friday, April 14th, for our Leadership Ideas Festival, when we'll showcase much of the work, research, and service that comes out of Georgia College's leadership programs. I encourage you, anything that you heard, whether it was in our conversation, perhaps that General Breedlove shared, please use the hashtag for the public good and tag us on social media at Lead Creatively. Again, I want to thank you all for being here, and please join me once again in thanking General Philip Breedlove for joining us at Georgia College.
Thank you.
General, thank you.
Yeah, that's all good.
Thank you, sir.